All right. Oh, thanks everyone for coming. Uh, my name is Megan Altendorf, and I am the head of advocacy for AIA Seattle's Committee on Homelessness. We're hosting tonight's event, and first off, I want to thank MG2 for allowing us to use their awesome space and for the refreshments they provided for us. We really appreciate it. I also want to thank all of my committee members who have worked really hard to put this event together. We're really excited. And then lastly, I want to thank our guest, Daniel Simons. He is a principal at David Baker Architects in San Francisco. He has more than 20 years of experience in the architecture field and is focused on multifamily housing. His award-winning projects include affordable senior and family housing, supporting housing for formerly homeless residents, modular housing, and market-rate mixed-use developments. His extensive knowledge of green building practices and progressive city planning to minimize the building's environmental impact while improving the quality of life for residents has been a major focus of his practice. Without any further ado, I will introduce Daniel. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I'm Daniel Simons, principal at David Baker Architects. I've been there for like 17 or 18 years. So just a little bit about the firm. We have 40 people in 3 different offices. We have an office in San Francisco, one in Oakland, and one in Birmingham, Alabama. This is us on the roof deck of a project that's under construction. We are an interdisciplinary office, so we have architecture, which is mostly what we're going to talk about here today, and kind of all scales, from single-family homes up to 500 or 600 unit apartment buildings. We do a lot of housing. This is one of my favorite slides because the projects on either side of the street are both projects that we designed. They both have 350 square foot apartments, and one of them is for formerly homeless, and the other one, the 350 square foot apartment, sold for about $1,500 to $1,600 a square foot. So the question is, can you guess which is which? Which is the affordable? Anyway, the affordable one's the one on the right. So we approach these projects regardless of whether they're for really wealthy people or formerly homeless the same way. We also do hospitality. This is a hotel that we just finished in Healdsburg that is too expensive even for me to stay in. Urban design, we like to look at sort of the overall urban scale as well as the building scale. We have an interiors practice. This is a cafe that we did at the Facebook campus in Frank Gehry's building. And we have a small fabrication shop in our Oakland office where we build things. So we do, these are prototypes for a hotel refresh that we were doing on one of the hotels that we designed about 15 years ago. In addition to that, we have what we call DBA Lab, which is kind of all of our pro bono and experimental projects. This is a temporary installation on the site of an affordable housing project that will eventually be here when they get financing many years from now. But in the interim, the nonprofit that we were working with wanted to activate the space, and so they created a market and a stage that they have events every couple weeks. And the idea was that the market spaces would be used as incubators. So people in the neighborhood who have ideas for restaurants or other businesses could come and try them out, and then eventually, hopefully, when the building gets built, there'll be a place, a sort of a locally grown business that can go into the retail spaces. And one of the places that they kind of started working with here, they own the building next door, which is the California Hotel. which is also 100% affordable, permanently supportive housing for formerly homeless. And it has retail on the ground floor. And one of the businesses that started as part, that they kind of connected with as part of this, was so successful that they moved into that ground floor retail, and there's a restaurant right next to the site now, which is great for this part of Oakland. So I'm going to talk today about is we kind of, within our office, we think a lot about what the purpose of designing housing is. So it's not just about building a place for people to live, right? It's trying to create a home for people. And what does that mean? And how do people feel at home? And what is the way that there's a sense of community, so that when you come home at the end of the day, it doesn't feel like you just live in an apartment, but you live somewhere that you belong. And we came up with these 9 principles, which we've been kind of refining and cultivating over the last few years, that we think contribute. There were 8, and then there were 11. There's lots of different variations on this. Right now it's 9. It's kind of make the grid looks nice. We had friends of ours who are graphic designers come up with these cool little things. So that's, we're designers, so we're subject to those kind of whims. And hopefully it'll be a book at some point in the not too distant future. So the first one is called Renew the Urban Fabric. And this is really more about urban design scale projects than it is about housing, but I think they're obviously related. So the idea is to sort of look outside the borders of your site and think about a lot of the sites that we deal with affordable housing are in neighborhoods that have been sort of damaged by various bad decisions around planning or development or other things, and trying to figure out what it is, within the project scope, how can you repair those? How can you fix what's happening outside with the project that you're building? So this is, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this project. This is a 7.5 acre project in Oakland with the Oakland Housing Authority, and it was redevelopment of an existing 88 unit project. We doubled the density, and expanded the land. So this site has a new library and a new school that are sort of off to the left, and then down on the bottom, on the right here, there's a rec center and a church, and the housing kind of connects the two. Oh, and a park. So on the left, you can see the existing site plan. I don't know if I can point with this thing. I probably can't point at this, right? Pointers never work on screens. Anyway, so it's sort of hard to tell, but if you, I'm just going to go over here and wave my hands. So this is the rec center, and there's the park. And up there, that's the library under construction and the school. And so if you were a kid getting out of school, to walk to the rec center, you had to go kind of off the screen, back around here, and down to there, right? So this is clearly, and this is an industrial piece of land that the Housing Authority bought. So there's this opportunity, right? Like, the project isn't just about replacing this really dilapidated, World War II housing and turning an old pasta factory into housing. It's also about thinking about the neighborhood. So at the end of the day, this is sort of a rendering of our final site plan. We created all these pedestrian connections where we actually created a bit of new street. So if you were driving, you could get there a little bit more directly, but then there's also a pedestrian connection here that sort of brings everybody so that all the assets of the neighborhood are available to the residents. So this is before we started with, broken, gated community. The gates never worked, and this is at the end of the day, creating these sort of pedestrian streets where kids can play and ride their bikes and get from the park to the rec center, over to the library or the school. The second one, make big moves, is pretty straightforward. So affordable housing is super challenged budget-wise. Like, we always end up in value engineering, right? We always end up cutting all kinds of things out of it. And so this is really about this idea that that the building, if you kind of strip away all the bells and whistles, all the nice materials, all the whatever, trellises, balconies, is it still something that, like, stands out and has a presence? as a really great building. And that's kind of this idea, sort of making some move that you don't have to rely on, beautiful detailing, excellent construction, wonderful materials, which we would all love to do as architects. But that's not necessarily in our palette as we're working on these kinds of projects. Here's some diagrams of just some different projects that we did and kind of what those moves look like. So this is an affordable senior housing project in Oakland, and had a really sort of tough southwest facing facade that was really, and so we just took advantage of that and, just played with the windows and some sun shading to try and figure out how to come up with something that's different. There's a project in Sacramento, again, just taking an exterior stair and kind of, bending it and wrapping it in a material to give it some presence on the street, regardless of what got cut out of it. Project in San Francisco. This is a rendering of a project which is actually now complete. I just got TCO in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. And this is a project in Union City, which is sort of the suburbs of the Bay Area. And just creating this portal, this like double height space that you walk through to get into the apartment building, that you get to the front door. It has this really wonderful grand scale. Even if you ended up, losing, it's just stucco that's painted different colors. It's not like, we have anything wonderful going on. Similar project. This was in the Bayview in San Francisco, and we worked with a community group that wanted, they were really interested in this idea of Afrocentric design, and one of the things that they really honed in on was that Afrocentric design shouldn't be rectilinear. And so we're like, well, we got to make the building pretty much rectilinear, right? I mean, like most of the building has to be rectilinear. We can't afford to have the whole thing be curves. But can we have a moment where we do something like really kind of sculptural and unique that stands out as completely different? Along the same vein as that is that, if we do get some premium material or something special, it's usually just a little bit of it. And so when you're in this moment of, value engineering and cost cutting, and you're trying to like figure out what it is that you want to hold on to, if you've done the entire thing in some expensive material, there's no way you're going to be able to afford it. But can you sort of judiciously use something that's a premium and really focus that in a place that's important both to the neighborhood and to the project to make it clearly, kind of to make it worth spending the money on, and kind of getting everybody on the project team really kind of invested in it, so that in that moment when we're all desperate and trying to figure out how to make the budget work, we don't lose it, right? So if everybody understands the value of this moment, this sort of special material, is this premium thing that we've got, everybody on the development team and the contracting team, everybody gets it, then you're much more likely to be able to hold on to it as you're. So this is an affordable for sale project in San Francisco that's basically just like lap siding, hardy lap siding, except for the entry, which is an exterior entry, is clad in cedar with like a copper roof and this kind of beautiful copper downspout. And it's one of these things that, again, like, people say, well, how can you possibly afford it on affordable housing? Well, it's like maybe like 2% of the exterior cladding. Yeah, so it was a lot more expensive for that little bit, but it's not that much of it. Why is that not going forward? There we go. Same thing here. We used a brick on the right-hand side. We used a brick, basically brick tile. It's not even really brick. It's like 3/8 of an inch thick. But using it and then having a way, it's this sort of pixelated. It goes from dark on one end to light on the other, and it sort of transitions across the whole thing. And it's not, probably again maybe 15 to 20% of the facade is this premium material, but it really sort of defines the building. It's the thing that people think of when they think of these projects. This is an affordable project that we just finished in Mission Bay, and it's the same idea. I mean, it's, I don't know, basically almost an entire city block. It's like 200 units of family housing, and 85% of it is just stucco, painted colors. But there's this one facade where we got this Core 10 screen with this sort of custom perforation on it, and And it really does, it becomes this defining element in the project, and it doesn't necessarily, destroy the budget. The next idea is thinking about how the buildings meet the street and how your building relates to the public, kind of on all fronts. And we call it activate the edges, just sort of that interface between your building and the public realm, and making sure that you design it in a way that works both for the building but also for the neighbors. This is, retail. Retail is the obvious. If you're in a neighborhood that supports retail and you get to do retail, that's easy-ish. It's really easy to screw up retail too, I think, and especially to think about, the neighborhood that you're in. So this is in a neighborhood in San Francisco called Hayes Valley, which is really known for small retail. And this is a pretty big project. It's, the frontage is like one whole city block. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about the scale of the neighborhood stores, which are about like 12 to 15 feet wide, and set the building up so that it was divided up into pieces on the ground floor that are similar to the scale of the existing context. But, and then we have this, transom across the top, which is this consistent thing that we basically kind of wrote into the project. They're not allowed to change, but everything below that, they can do whatever they want with. So actually this corner was designed by a different architect, and they ripped out the storefront that we had and did, butt glazed, and it's a super fancy restaurant. But it still has the consistency in that it relates to all the other retail on the block, and it still has that feel of kind of Hayes Valley, even though it's really distinct and unique. So this is that project. So you've got the whole frontage on the front, which is storefront, but then you've got residential that comes down to grade around the perimeter. And how do you deal with all these different conditions? So like I said, retail is an obvious one. That's easy. This is a project in San Francisco where there's no way we could possibly support retail. Like it's, in a neighborhood that doesn't have that kind of pedestrian, traffic or anything. So we have all this common space though, right? We've got offices and other things, and we could design them to have that feel, right? To have the same sort of scale and proportion of retail, maybe throw in a little bit of, interest with color, so that as you're walking by this, it still has that sort of public realm, sort of civic scale to the building, even though you're basically looking into the property management offices. Sometimes there's residential on grade, and so how do you interface with the public realm when it's somebody's apartment? Giving them a buffer. Stoops, like retail, are like a really easy answer. It's like, we'll just put a stoop there. Stoops are also really hard to do well. They're really easy to screw up. I think that it seems like a logical thing. We'll just put a little patio out there and a couple steps down. Everybody will be happy. It doesn't. I think there are these subtleties about, how much sense of privacy, how much, what's public, how do you interface with the public realm? What is the public realm that you're interfacing with? Like, this is a pretty exposed looking stoop, but this street is just like a mid-block passage. It's not like a public street, so it has a much more intimate feel to it. Same here, creating a little sense with a bench. There's some sense of privacy, but it's still clearly public. Kind of more of the same. This is another use that we've kind of had a lot of success with on projects, which is what we call, live work, or sort of flex lofts or something along those lines, where basically we don't really know what the use is going to be, but we design it so that it has a lot of different possible and uses, a lot of life, depending on what. So when we designed these, we thought, maybe people would live there. But in this case, actually, there were about 10 of them along here, and the local arts college rented them all and ripped out the walls in between them and turned it into CCA's sort of like campus. It's a few blocks away from their main campus, so they use it as like art gallery and space. So I think that, one of the things about that ground floor is that you don't want to be too specific in the way you design it, right? Because you don't really know exactly how it's going to be used. I mean, sometimes if it's an apartment and it's somebody's front door, it's going to be that way. But with this retail, where maybe retail won't be successful, or it's some other kind of use. So designing it in a way that it has just some flexibility. Here's an interior of that. And you can kind of see all the doors, because we were sort of thinking that they were going to be like these little 12-foot wide things, but actually it didn't turn out that way. Be welcoming is kind of, I don't want to say the stupidest one, but like the most obvious one, which is that really it's important to have a nice front door, basically. That like when you come home, that there's a place that feels like you've arrived somewhere, right? That you're not just like walking in through a side door into some big building. So this is, just having a nice big overhang, using some premium material for the door. In this case, you walk through that. You walk through this front door, and it looks like you're going into a building, but actually you just enter into this courtyard where the mail is. So it has this really kind of wonderful scale where it's like open to the outdoors, and you've got the plants growing, and it would be really easy. For instance, in this particular case, there was a discussion about enclosing this and sort of making this lobby like a separate thing. And it's like, again, you wouldn't have the budget to do it all out of storefront, so it would be solid walls, and then the windows would get smaller, and you'd end up with this kind of dark, not really great space that you come in through the front door, instead of having it be this sort of wonderful open to the courtyard moment. And this is kind of coming from the other side, the same thing. You come through a door and you enter into this space, and the courtyard just bleeds right in there. This is a project that we did in Charleston, South Carolina. And sometimes the dress or the awning or whatever that connects to, that sort of brings you from the street into the courtyard, it doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to be a big, beautiful thing. It can just be a small gesture that sort of lets people know that they've made it home. There we go. Same thing. This is a senior housing project, so having some outdoor space that's covered, so people are waiting for their rides or people to pick them up. They have a bench and a place to be, or a place to put their bike. All of these things make it feel like more like you've come home, that you have a place that you belong. In this case, sometimes these ways that kind of overlap a little bit. So, but like this fence here has got a bunch of sayings or sort of statements that came out of community meetings that sort of relate to the history and the context of the neighborhood. So as you come in, you're reminded of the place that you are. Again, sort of reinforcing this idea of being rooted in a place as opposed to just a random apartment building. So with Cultivate Connection, the idea is thinking about how the day-to-day activities, sort of the routine of living in your apartment building or in your home, where are the opportunities within that for informal connections with people in your building? Like, how do you design those spaces to sort of reinforce those moments where you get to know your neighbors and where you begin to feel like you live somewhere as opposed to just renting an apartment there? So this is a courtyard in an apartment building that we designed, and it has, on the ground floor there's a community room, and then on the upper floor there's like this walkway with a whole bunch of activities. There's laundry and a lounge, and they each take up a little bit of a space along there, but they're all related to each other. So no matter whether you're coming down to use the barbecue or whether you're coming there to do your laundry, that you bump into your neighbors, you connect. So it's really just sort of aggregating all these uses and making them sort of nice spaces to be, not just sort of left over in the corner where you had some extra square footage. This one actually sort of didn't work as well as we hoped. We had this wonderful idea that there would be this grand stair connecting the second floor to the ground floor so that you would walk through. And our local disability advocates didn't feel that that was equal, facilitation for people in wheelchairs, even though there is an elevator, but you have to walk into the building, use the elevator, and come back out. That wasn't good enough. So we had to take the stair out, which is kind of sad, but it would have been really great if the stair was there. This is up on that second floor. There's a play area with blue AstroTurf, which the kids really love, and it's right by the laundry room. Same idea, you're doing your laundry, your kid wants to run around, like creating all those spaces so that they interact with each other, and you really have this chance to meet your neighbors. The kids get to play together, and this is a view out from one of those rooms, which is just a small little TV room. Same thing, this is a different project, but the same idea with like the computer room, the laundry, the TV lounge. All of it is related and sort of has a nice scale to it. Feels like a bright, airy place where you'd want to be. Not, laundry rooms often end up like in the basement, or the computer room doesn't need light, so why would we, put it someplace other than a dark corner? So apartment buildings, I think one of the things, like, we culturally as Americans have a challenge with apartment buildings, and we don't like them. Like lots of other parts of the world, apartment buildings are really, it's where you live and people get it. And what I've come to realize is that a lot of that has to do with the corridors, right? Corridors have become this like long corridors without daylight in them. They're dehumanizing, or at least that's what we think of. And so when people think, oh, I don't want to live in an apartment building, a lot of it has to do with that they don't really want to walk into a dark, stair with no daylight and down a corridor without daylight. So enlightened circulation is really sort of, that the experience of being in a building is about getting from the front door to your apartment building or to your apartment. And so that experience, can be wonderful. And if it is wonderful, then it changes your whole perspective on what it's like to live in that building. This is that same project in Charleston, South Carolina. And Charleston has this really cool building type called the Charleston single house. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Charleston, but basically it's like single family homes, these wonderful old single family homes. And basically the way they would set up is it's like a single family home with a big porch on it, and then there's a garden, and then there's another building and a porch and a garden. It kind of goes down the street. And you actually enter into the porch, and when you walk in, and some of the porches have like, the front door to the street looks like a building, but when you get into it, you're on the porch. So on your left is the building, on your right is the garden. So we're doing this affordable senior housing project, and we thought, okay, so what can we do to I should also preface this by saying that the local architect we were working with said, every architect comes to Charleston and says, oh, I'm going to build a single house. And so he said, don't do that. So what can we do? What is it about that space, that sort of interstitial space, the porch and the relationship between the porch and the garden and the apartment that feels so local and cultural, and also really can make a wonderful place to be. So we created, I should go back. So this is basically like a Motel 6. In that Motel 6 have exterior walkways that go to apartments, right? Or to rooms. And so the typology is pretty straightforward, cost effective, pretty simple, and usually pretty awful. So what can you do, with this same idea and make it someplace that really feels like, again, like a home? So we started with Charleston get really hot in the summer. So thinking about some sort of shading device that's actually operable so the panels can move depending on how the people who are sitting there want, depending on the shade. And then we also took this normal, like on a Motel 6, it would be like a 4-foot wide walkway with a little railing. And we said, okay, what if we made it like 15 feet wide and we put ceiling fans out there? And we made it a place where the residents want to be, so that as you're walking around this, you meet your neighbors and you connect. And then the nonprofit developer that we're working with bought rocking chairs for everybody who moved in so that they could put them out on the porch, which is I think actually the reason that it's successful. So here's from interior of one of these apartments are quite small. They're long, sort of narrow, thin apartments, but they each have, this is their front door, which opens out onto this porch. So this is another, this is the community center for a large development where there's housing above, and there's like 6 or 8 blocks of housing around it that are all using this community center. It's on a really steep site, and where you are right now is basically underground. So you're looking down a long corridor to, and there's housing above. But by creating an opening in the back part of this sort of basement and allowing daylight and creating a little, seating area here, when you walk in, this is what you see when you walk in the front door. Instead of seeing down a long corridor that's dark to what is essentially a basement, you kind of catch this glimpse of light that's coming down from above, and when you come in here, you've got this wonderful courtyard that feels really light in area, even though there's like 4 stories of housing around this oculus up on 3 sides. So get personal. There's kind of 2 aspects to this. I think one is, how do you engage with a community before you start designing so that you understand the place where you're working and the people who are going to be living there? And then the other is, how do you allow the people who move in after the building is done some way to sort of take ownership of it and present their selves, their event, who they are to the rest of the world in this community that you're developing. So they both end up sort of reflecting the character of this community. This is one of my favorite quotes. There's a really wonderful movie called Citizen Architect, which is about Sam Mockbee. And in it, he interviews a bunch of architects about designing affordable housing. So this is Peter Eisenman, said, I would love to do low-income housing, but do I need to engage with the people who live in the units? And so the best part is the answer. Just no, I don't believe so. The architect is supposed to know what they want. And I think that we do come to these projects with all these preconceptions and these ideas that, we've been doing this forever. We know how it's supposed to go. We know what this neighborhood wants, what these people want. And I think that, the way to create buildings that really feel of a particular place and a particular time is to admit that you don't really know what they want and to go in with an open mind. So on the left is a master plan that we did to win a project in Charleston, North Carolina. And to the right is what the project actually looked like after we finished designing it with community input. And I think that, it would be there's lots of really great things about the site plan on the left. But once we went and met with people and really tried to learn about what it was in this neighborhood that in this part of the country that honestly we didn't even really know that well, that we realized that we'd kind of done it all wrong. And that, humility and just being honest about the fact that we don't really know a lot is a critical part of making sure that you design buildings that are of a place. So one of the tools that we have to kind of really engage people is community design charrettes, where we actually engage with people and try and get them to design their neighborhoods. So this is a different project. This is in Daly City, right near San Francisco, where we were redeveloping 15 acres and putting 500 units on a site that had 150 with the city park. And so here we had tables and we worked through with people and sort of, these are all the different things that folks came up with. This kind of amazing array of different ways to sort of organize the site and lay it out. And then we kind of diagrammed that to sort of understand what were the connections and where were the green spaces and where the housing went. And so this is just an example of what we did when we were talking about the green space. So we overlaid them on top of each other and we're like, oh, well, it's clear the park belongs in that corner of the site, right? And when you have this, when you're meeting with other stakeholders like the city or the housing authority or whoever else is involved in this project, and you can kind of show them this process that you went through, where you kind of extracted from the neighbors what they want out of their neighborhood. It's amazingly powerful, and it really, it ended up being instrumental in getting the project approved. So now, let's say we've gone through that process, we've built the building, how do we give people an opportunity to sort of make their own little stamp on where they live? So one really, again, very simple, stupid little thing to do is just to give people a little shelf by their front door so that they can put things out there. And what's really funny about these is that they start off empty. Nobody puts anything out. And then it's kind of like it's contagious. Like one person puts their pot out there, and then everybody's like, oh, yeah, I can put my pot out there. And then somebody has a picture of their grandchild, and then like everybody has pictures of their grandchildren. And it's like it is this great sort of social connection where you have to have the person who starts first. But once they do, it really has this great, and people go crazy. This woman had this amazing rotating, that's her graduating from from a local community college. She was really proud of it, and so she had this, this plaque basically made so that she could stick it out here on her front, so that people knew that she had graduated. And it's just it's a great thing, and it's so easy, right? It's just like a little shelf. This one has a little clip, so you can hang things on it. We've done a bunch of different versions of it. We've realized that it actually doesn't really matter what it is. People use it. You just have to get something out there. The other thing is, just working with property management to allow people to put things on their porches and stoops. It seems, again, really obvious and simple, but it is very challenging. There's a lot of rules in these apartment buildings, and sometimes people leave things out here that you don't want to look at. And so I get why there's rules, but then there's other people like this who, they take advantage of this little porch that they give, and they put their pots out there, and it makes all the difference. So another way, a lot of these projects that we work with, they have art programs, or they have other classes like that they do as part of their, the services that happen in the building. So thinking about ahead of the game, where can there be opportunities in the design to present for them to put their art out so that it gets viewed. So this presentation wall is in a senior housing project that we did, and we knew that the nonprofit that we were working with had this great art program, and so we had them, we told them we were going to give them these spaces that they could sort of use, and it's this great rotating gallery. Every time you go in, there's different stuff out there. This is, again, sort of mining what the nonprofits that you're working with have, as opportunities. This particular one really felt like that there were a lot of people who were going to have things that they made that they wanted to sell. And so we created basically like a resident store in this senior center, and everything in there is made by people who live in the building. But it's this opportunity for people to sort of, that it's of their place, and they get to kind of show who they are. So the last one is Art for All. And again, this is pretty straightforward. It's just sort of, finding any opportunity you can to get art into the project. So, whether it's actually an art room that has art in it, or whether you, commission individual pieces. We've started working a lot with a really great nonprofit down in the Bay Area called Creativity Explored that does sort of provides studio space for people with developmental disabilities. And what they've allowed us to do is they've allowed us to license their art and then print it really large on vinyl and stick it up on the wall, so it doesn't become this precious thing, but it has huge scale. And you can use it for wayfinding. So this is like an elevator lobby in a project, and then each one has a different piece of art. So as you get off the floor, you kind of know where you are by the art that's there, and it's pretty affordable. It can also be very specific, commissioned art. So this is one of our DBA lab projects. We did a pro bono design for a Nepalese restaurant for a woman who had graduated from this program in the Bay Area called La Cocina, which is it's a nonprofit that helps women who have food businesses sort of learn how to grow them into larger businesses, whether they're restaurants or catering or whatever. And so this woman, Beanie, had graduated, and she got a space, and we designed the restaurant for her, but then we also helped her find a muralist who sort of did a mural that is her history. This is a project, again, this is like commissioned art, which is more straightforward, in a project in Union City. And we worked with an artist who got really enamored by this thing, which to me looked like a weed, but apparently is like a native plant that's rare. And so she decided that she wanted to do an 80-foot tall version of it, which, at first I was a little skeptical, but it's actually this pretty wonderful thing. And the thing that I love most about this is that she then took an opportunity to engage with the residents around a portion of it. So on the right is what came out of her community meetings, what their sort of vision of the future of this neighborhood should be. She did this like sort of alternative future, and then the roots become welcome in every different language that's spoken on in the project. So here are the folks making sure that they got the letters right. But it has this great connection to the site in terms of being this plant that's native, but also in terms of the people who live here. So that's it. I also have cards with the 9 ways on them if people want them. And I have buttons. If people like any one of the ways, I have about 60 or 70 buttons here. And you're more than welcome to come and take one. We've got them for each one of the different ways, so you can kind of pick your favorite and wear it around Seattle. Anybody have any questions? Yeah, that sort of also falls into our kind of DBA lab. We have a whole post-occupancy program that we've kind of piloted. We found that, so we work with a lot of nonprofits. We have a long relationship with them where we do many buildings with them. And we realized that so once the building is done and it's occupied and the development staff has moved on to somebody else, and the property management staff is just trying to kind of make it work. And it's really hard to get momentum to go back and look at buildings. Like, nobody has any time, nobody has any money. But what we found is that when you're starting the next project with them, they've got a new site and they're like, oh, and everybody's all engaged and they're excited about the potential of this new site, you can say, oh, well, okay, so let's just go back and look at the last few we did, or maybe ones that we didn't do. Like, if we're working with nonprofits that have done, used other architects, can we go back and look and see how things worked? And so we have like a Google poll that we do with property management staff, and we have a bunch of kind of different techniques for getting feedback from residents. So we've sort of started. I would still say it's pretty fledgling. It is kind of amazing in the world of affordable housing where so many developers own and operate their buildings for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. How little kind of resident surveys and feedback there are. How infrequent it is that we have the opportunity. So we're trying to build on it, and yeah. What are your thoughts on public gardens? Yeah, I mean, I think so. What we've learned about all of our really bright ideas is that they fail unless there's someone on the nonprofit staff who really wants to make sure that they succeed. So the key is understanding your client and really sitting down with them and thinking about what the programs are that they have, that they're invested in as an organization, that they can kind of maintain and sort of have momentum. So we have a bunch of clients who love, they've got community gardens at every single one of their projects, and they're awesome. And then there's other ones where we've designed community gardens, and they're completely, we ended up having to go put landscaping in them because no one was taking care of them. So I think it's really true of a lot of things in these projects is that there's, it's true up here in Seattle too, but in the Bay Area we have this amazing group of nonprofit developers who do an incredible job of maintaining and they're all really innovative and interesting, but they all have their own little thing. So like we have one client that always has an after-school program, like that's their thing. And so we've really worked with them to sort of create design standards for that room. Like what is that room? How many kids? What are the age ranges of the kids in there? How does that work? So I think you have to, you can't design it in a vacuum, right? You have to kind of figure out what it is that works for your client, and that's the thing that's most likely to succeed. Yeah. Yeah, I think we've started doing these things called which we took from like more technical buildings, like owner's project requirements, like OPR documents, where we really sit down with our clients at the beginning and we walk through. We don't necessarily present the 9 ways, but we walk through projects. And again, sometimes it comes out of that post-occupancy stuff. So you go and you visit a bunch of projects, and there's stuff that people like in these projects, and then you document it, right? You sit down with them and you say, okay, like we went to these 5 buildings, and everybody loved this and this and this and this, and you get kind of like institutional buy-in, right? Where they're kind of agreeing that these are the priorities of this project. And so it doesn't always work, but when you run up against that, because you always run into that situation where you're desperate to figure out how to make it fit the budget, and it isn't fitting the budget, and you're trying to cut things out. But I think that when you have this list of things that are really important, and we've all agreed that they're really important, it tends to they stick a little bit more, that people try harder to keep them. Doesn't always work, but it helps. Yeah. Right. Yeah, we have a lot of tools for community engagement, and a lot of them are about sort of educating people, about what is possible. But in general, what we do is we kind of show them pictures of things. Like that's our go-to. So if there's, lots of good examples there's so many good examples of all these things that, and these and many more, right? There's so many great examples of really well-designed affordable housing and really successful kinds of services and all sorts of things. And so when you begin to work with a community group or future residents or whatever, I think, we spend a lot of time just showing them precedents and sort of getting them. We do this, we have what our green dot exercise where we put boards of pictures all over the place, and then we hand out, you get 10 green dots, and you get to walk around and put the green dot on the thing that you love. And it's amazing. It just, you at the end of the day, you have these great pictures of the boards, and there's all these green dots on this picture, and all these green dots on this picture, and all these green, and that's how people sort of, get engaged and sort of, and it's a powerful tool with clients and other folks because they see what people are, interested in. And sometimes you learn something, like we're doing this project in the peninsula, down in East Palo Alto in the Bay Area, which is a very car-centric part of the Bay Area. And, we were talking about how we should have bike parking, and they're just like, oh, nobody rides bikes down here. And so we literally just had this thing, which was like, how do you get to work? How do you get to school? How do you shop? And it was like bike, bus, car, and people just put their dots. And it's true that the car was pretty heavily done, but there were a lot of dots on biking and buses. and it was just kind of eye-opening. Like people had this preconception of what people like and what they want, and often they're wrong. We had another project that we were doing in Chinatown with a nonprofit that's very connected with the Asian community down there, and we had all these. It was sort of about exterior design, so we had all these kind of cool, interesting, modern buildings, and we had sort of some which were kind of, I don't know, Asian themed kind of cheesy things that had been built, and because they were like, no, this is what people are going to want, and I think that it was amazing to me to see like all of the like Chinese grandmothers who didn't speak English going up and putting their dots on like the super modern cool buildings, like they have this people have this perception of what somebody else wants, and it's often wrong. Yeah, there's a lot of good ones up here. Sharon from Lehigh, sitting right in the front, has developed some really wonderful ones. I love the one that you guys did in and the one in Ballard with the urban rest stop. The urban rest stop is such a brilliant idea, and like ever since Sharon showed me her urban rest stop, I've been pitching it to people, and like nobody's bought. But someday I'm going to find somebody who will do it. But it's just it's a great thing where they have like laundry and showers, and and so that people who are homeless can come in and they can clean up and go to the work or go to a job interview or whatever. And it's just like, it's such an obvious thing, right? Like if you're homeless, you don't have a place to do that. But it takes an organization that actually is going to staff it and operate it. And I've yet to find one. but though, I mean, I'm definitely inspired by that. I mean, the obvious inroad is to be involved in the projects that are getting built and try and make them as good as possible. But yeah, I feel like we, in addition to presentations like this about design, I mean, I think that we try and get out there and sort of advocate just on like a housing policy level as well. And there are a lot of decisions that are made about, like, the more I'm involved in it, the more I realize that like the zoning and urban planning side of things is really the area where we need to be pushing our efforts, because that's where, like, so in the Bay Area, I mean, you think you have a housing crisis, but you don't know. Like, we really have a housing crisis in the Bay Area. And like, the more I think about it, it's all these things that are sort of outside of, so San Francisco, which is the most expensive place to live in the country, 2/3 of the land area is zoned for single-family homes or duplexes. So just think about that. Like, 2/3 of the land area has like densities that are just ridiculously low, and I'm sure Seattle is probably the same thing. And so yeah, we need to get out there and be the people at the non-NIMBYs at the community meetings. I mean, like, to go to the community meetings and be out there and saying, like, no, I live in this neighborhood and I want density. I want more people living here. Because ultimately, to sort of solve all the housing crises that we have, I mean, it's not just about building affordable housing. We also have to build market rate housing. And I think that that's hard for some housing advocates to wrap their heads around. But I think it's, I'm fond of saying that the laws of supply and demand apply to housing, despite what you've heard. That like, if there's more housing built, it is more affordable. And so yeah, I think we need to be engaged on like a policy level. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple different things. One is that there's land like, and Seattle's starting to do it, and California's starting to do it as well. There's a lot of land that the city, the state, the county owns, and that could be housing, but instead is just like a parking lot, or nothing, and that we need to get it's happening like in San Francisco, but not in other jurisdictions. We need to get our local officials realizing that this land is a resource and that they should give it to people who are developing or sell it to them at a really low value, the affordable housing. There's also ways if there are like density incentives and other things that allow affordable housing developers to develop on parcels that wouldn't actually make sense for market rate developers. So like in California, we have a state density bonus law, which basically says that if you're doing 100% affordable, you get to do more, you get to break the rules, basically. You don't have to follow some of the zoning codes, and you get to do more density than would be allowed otherwise. And I think that it's kind of like, it's not enough yet, but I think there's been a lot of discussion, at least in California, about this idea that if we made it so that there were parcels of land that like the market rate folks aren't interested in because they can only get 5 units on it and there's all these setbacks and height limits, but affordable housing developers could do 20 or 30 units, and that they could get exceptions to all these things, that it would then, that land would become valuable to the nonprofits, even though it's not necessarily valuable to the for-profits. But yeah, I mean, affordable housing requires some level of subsidy. It's not going to be able to compete on the open market for land with market rate developers. What was your reaction to public land? Yeah, I mean, I think it's I don't know, this whole like debate about so I taught a studio down at UC Berkeley, and we had this so in California around BART land, which is sort of our one public transportation that we have, the state basically just said to cities, either you upzone the parking lots around BART or we will. You have 3 years to figure out what you want to do, and here are the minimum densities that you have to hit. And so the BART folks, basically said, okay, well, that's fine, but you have to pay us market rate for these things because we own this, and we have like a public, financial responsibility to not give land away. And in the class that I taught, there was a really wonderful group of students who went through the whole history of redlining and how that the land was taken by eminent domain, and they were like, no, this land belongs to the people who are going to live in this affordable housing project. They shouldn't have to pay BART for it, basically. And so I think that there's this, you have to it depends on the perspective that you come to it, right? I think that a lot of this land, if it's public land and it's owned and it's for the benefit of people, whether it's affordable, and I guess it also gets to this idea that I think it's really important that we build market rate housing too. Like that we need to encourage, I mean, and again, it's sort of different here, although Seattle's catching up with us. Seattle's done a pretty good job of building a market rate housing. I mean, if you look at like production levels by comparison to what we are in California, but I think that we need to stop penalizing, we need to stop taxing market rate housing to pay for affordable housing. Like, it's not fair that the folks who are building market rate housing right now have to pay for like 30 years of us not building enough housing. You know what I mean? Like, so if you come in and you say, oh yeah, you have to build 30% affordable and you have to pay in lieu fees and you have to do all this stuff, and you end up crushing development in San Francisco, which is starting to happen. Like, we're not seeing a lot of new market rate housing getting built in San Francisco because the extractions that are being putting on these market rate projects are so great. And I think we have to be a little careful. Like, you have to just be a little bit like, there's two sides to each coin. Yeah, Um, it's a good question. I mean, I would say overall our buildings are pretty efficient. You know, that we're kind of relentless. I mean, more often than not, when a nonprofit comes to us with a site, we come back and tell them that they can get more apartments on it than they thought they could. And so when you start from that point of view, where you're like, oh no, you could do 150, but let's do 140, and you thought you were only going to get 130, then that helps, right? So being really smart about like knowing the zoning regulations, understanding which things you can push, what things are likely to be accepted as variances and other stuff is kind of the magic sauce to sort of get more density. So yeah, we spent a lot of time kind of like combing through zoning codes and meeting with local planning folks and local housing advocates to understand like what buttons we can push. And like now with all this state legislation that's coming down, where like in California, the state is like writing all this legislation. There's like 100 bills in the state right now to try and create more housing. Like we have somebody who's like just on top of that stuff, so that when we go and meet with people, we say, oh yeah, but there's this new bill that's going to help you kind of get around that rule or do that. And then you can kind of push the density levels up. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody.